Good day, everyone. For today's lesson, we will discuss the topic of adventure games. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to learn about the following: definition of adventure games, common features of adventure games, gameplay mechanics of adventure games, and art and user interface of adventure games. What are adventure games? An adventure game is an interactive story about a character whom the player controls. The player's avatar is a fictional person, a protagonist, the hero of the story. This definition doesn't mean that there is no conflict in adventure games, only that combat is not a primary activity. Adventure games seldom have an internal economy. Manipulating or optimizing an economic system is not part of the experience. This sets them apart from role-playing games. The earliest adventure games were text-only, which made them inexpensive to develop and allowed great scope for both the designers and the players' imaginations. As soon as personal computers began to develop graphics capability, developers started to add graphics to adventure games, and the games really took off. The arrival of 3D hardware also gave rise to a new sort of game. The action-adventure is faster-paced than a pure adventure game and includes physical and conceptual challenges. Action-adventure hybrids are now more popular than traditional adventure games. The lack of replayability seems the greatest disadvantage of adventure games. Consider making puzzle sequences or challenges that allow the player a choice of solutions that can affect the story itself. In practice, however, replayability isn't much of a problem. Game features. The setting contributes more to the entertainment value of an adventure game than settings in any other genre. The setting creates the world that the player explores and lives in. Adventure games are always single-player games, so they can't rely on social interactions to create richness. The games move more slowly, which gives designers the chance to create a world with a distinct emotional tone. Adventure games always use an avatar-based interaction model because the designer wants to put the player inside a story. Game designers eventually abandoned this model so that they could develop games in which the avatar possessed a personality of their own, someone who belonged in the game world rather than being a visitor there. Using a context-sensitive model lets you play cinematographer, using camera angles, composition, and lighting to enhance the story. A real-time 3D first-person perspective gives the player the best sense of being in the world. This perspective also tends to encourage a more action-oriented approach but doesn't offer as many opportunities for visual drama. The third-person perspective keeps the player's avatar constantly in view. This perspective is common for action-adventures in which the player might need to react quickly. Many adventure games connect the player's role with the game's activities. Almost all adventure games treat the story as a journey, mapping the plot of the story onto physical travel through the game world, so the player's role often involves travel or investigation. Be sure that the player's role is suitable for the genre, or it could be frustrating for the player. Adventure games establish a relationship between different locations in the world and different parts of the story. As adventure games became larger and began to include a more detailed story, designers started to break them into chapters. This made the story more linear, which made it both easier to write for and easier to program. With the arrival of 3D graphics and the action-adventure, areas occasionally offered simple side branches but few complex spaces to explore. To create dramatic tension, adventure games often presents a cutscene at the beginning of the game to set the mood for the story. The resolution of dramatic tension occurs at a moment called the dramatic climax. The heroic quest traditionally involves a movement from a time of low danger to a time of great danger. The most dramatic climax should be the last major climax in the game. Most adventure games supply a save game feature, so death isn't necessarily catastrophic. Stopping to save the game does tend to hurt the player's feeling of immersion. The majority of challenges in an adventure game are conceptual puzzles that can only be solved by lateral thinking. When designing puzzles, try to allow for lateral thinking. If there's more than one way to solve a puzzle, don't restrict the player to your preferred method. Adventure game designers have faced the problem of how to create realistic NPCs. Many games try to sidestep the problem entirely by setting the game in worlds with extremely few people. This certainly creates a mysterious atmosphere, but it suits only a limited range of stories. Most adventure game designers gave up on trying to create realistic conversations and devised the scripted conversation, a mechanism that became the de facto standard for both adventure games and CRPGs. The map that you give the player doesn't have to be complete at the beginning of the game. It can start out empty and be filled in as the player moves around, a process called automapping. You can also include the map as an item to be found in the game, along the lines of a treasure map. Automapping destroys the challenge imposed by mazes, but mazes are one of the most overused and least enjoyed features of adventure games. Another common feature of adventure games is automatic journal keeping. The game fills in a journal with text as the player goes along, recording important events or information that was uncovered. The journal gives you an opportunity to define the avatar's character through their use of language. Journals are ideal for games in which the player must collect informational clues. Avoid puzzles that can only be solved by trial and error. Variants of this puzzle are puzzles that require thinking too lateral, making it irrational, and the opposite reaction puzzle, which has a solution opposite from what is expected. Illogical spaces also require trial and error. Avoid puzzles that require outside knowledge. Other puzzles to avoid are click the right pixel puzzles that require clicking a specific pixel, backward puzzles that shows the solution before the puzzle, and FedEx puzzles that require carrying an object from one place to a different one. The presentation layer. The point-and-click interface is an indirect control mechanism that allows for mouse clicks to a corresponding accessible location, then the avatar walks to it. This interface works well in traditional adventure games with no action challenges. In a direct control user interface, the player steers the avatar around the game world. This is now the standard for action-adventure games, whether in third-person or context-sensitive camera models. Implementing both walk and run movement modes lets the player move slowly through unfamiliar spaces and quickly through familiar ones. If your game expects the player to examine everything closely for clues, the user interface must make slow and accurate movement possible. Graphic adventures typically include highlighted objects for identifying active objects. These objects can stand out from the background. In a graphic adventure game played with a handheld controller, designers often assign one button of the controller to a generic action. However, this method doesn't do as much to challenge the player's lateral thinking. Using a menu gives the player a clear picture of available choices, but the presence of the menu makes the game feel more like a software tool and less like a fantasy adventure. Most designers choose to give the player an inventory mechanism that they can open and close on demand. They should be able to do this with a single keystroke or button click. This should not obscure the whole screen. Summary. Adventure games are best known for their storytelling, but they also offer deeply challenging puzzles. To design an adventure game, your most important task is to create compelling characters and an interesting story and then combine them seamlessly with puzzle challenges to give the player a rewarding gameplay experience. The material used for this lesson was taken from Chapter 19 of the book Fundamentals of Game Design, 2nd edition by Ernest Adams. Thanks for listening.